I thought showing up was the one thing people who loved you would never fail at, until the day I learned how easily trust can be replaced by convenience. One lie slipped into my life without warning, and a single photo exposed everything they never meant me to see. The hurt didn't come loudly, it arrived in a quiet wave that rewrote years of moments I once excused. I didn't fight or argue. I just watched the truth reveal itself with a clarity I couldn't ignore. And in that stillness, something in me shifted. Their choice set off a chain of events none of us could take back. By the time the world started paying attention, it was already too late for them to control the story. And that was only the beginning of. I knew something was wrong the moment my mother's voice slipped into that careful tone she used whenever she was about to disappoint me without admitting she chose to. I was standing in my kitchen icing a plain chocolate cake, my son humming in the living room as he tested the candles one by one, when her call buzzed in. She didn't even bother with small talk. She went straight to how exhausted they both were, how they had so much going on, how they wished they could be here, but simply couldn't make it this time. Her words were clipped, polished, practiced, like she had rehearsed the excuses on her drive home. She tried to sound regretful, but it came out too smooth, and smoothness was always her giveaway. My father chimed in halfway through, adding a vague list of tasks he needed to finish around the house. I listened in silence, letting them run through every reason they thought would sound just responsible enough. They asked me to give my son their warmest wishes, and I said I would. Then I hung up and stood there, staring at the cake, feeling something tighten inside me in a way I hadn't felt in years. My parents had always treated my life like a polite detour from the one they preferred living. They liked showing up when it made them look attentive, staying just long enough to be seen by the right people. My son's past birthdays had been their favorite opportunities to prove how present they were as grandparents. But the moment the public eyes weren't involved, their attendance became optional. I had spent years smoothing over their absences, inventing gentle explanations for my son so he wouldn't feel the sting of being quietly ranked second to their social schedule. I thought I could keep shielding him forever. I thought they would at least care enough to pretend. But that afternoon, the mask slipped without warning, and the lie underneath was too sharp to ignore. Still, I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even tell them their excuses didn't match the half-laughing background chatter I could hear through the phone. I simply said, "All right, I understand," and hung up. I told myself it was just another small cut in a long line of cuts I had grown used to. I thought I could tuck it away like all the others. I thought I could move on. But then the next morning came. I woke early, cleaned up the kitchen, and scrolled my phone as I waited for my son to wake. And there it was. A single post. Then another. Then 5 more. My parents, stretched out on bright beach chairs, sunglasses tilted, drinks held up to the sunlight even though they never liked being photographed with any. My mother's caption, "Finally getting the rest we deserve." My father's, "Nothing better than a last-minute trip." They were smiling wider than they had at any of my son's birthdays. The images kept coming, walking on the sand, laughing with a group I didn't recognize, posing together like a couple who had never once claimed they were too busy for anything. I stared at those photos long enough that my screen dimmed twice. I felt something go still inside me. Not anger, not shock, just a quiet, absolute clarity, like a locked door had opened on its own. They hadn't missed the birthday because of exhaustion. They had skipped it because they didn't think it mattered. I had given them years of benefit of the doubt, and this time, they didn't even bother crafting an excuse that couldn't be exposed with one tap of my finger. They chose the beach. They chose themselves. And in doing so, they chose to show me exactly where I stood. My son came bounding into the kitchen asking if he could eat leftover cake for breakfast, and I forced myself to smile. I kept quiet. I didn't tell him anything about the photos. I didn't tell him what I had just realized. I let him stay in the version of the world where people didn't drop you for a better offer. And then the next day arrived, the one I hadn't mentioned to my parents at all. The morning moved in quick, controlled motions. I had been nominated months earlier for a national award recognizing a project I had worked on for years, and after a long selection process, I became one of the recipients chosen to speak on live television. The ceremony was high security. Invitations had been scanned weeks ahead. Guests were checked at the door, no exceptions. I had considered telling my parents about it, but a voice in me kept recalling old memories, years of them brushing past my accomplishments, attending only when the crowd was large or the cameras were involved. So I decided to go alone. Quietly. Cleanly. Without them. I didn't expect them to show up anyway. The auditorium lights were sharp and white, aimed to make every detail gleam. Producers moved like shadows behind rows of equipment, voices clipped and low as they coordinated the broadcast. Attendees found their seats in neatly aligned rows, murmuring as the cameras shifted above them. My name was on the program, listed near the middle, a placement chosen to hold the audience's attention. I moved through the room with a calm I didn't entirely understand. It felt like the world had paused just long enough for me to finally hear my own thoughts. When the ceremony began, I watched the stage through a haze of focused distance, waiting for my turn. The speeches before mine were polished and predictable. People clapped on cue, smiled on cue, nodded on cue. But beneath that orderly surface ran a current of tension I couldn't name. A producer glanced at me twice, then took a quick call, his eyes flicking toward the entrance. Another assistant walked briskly across the aisle, whispering to someone in a suit. Something was shifting at the edges of the room. When my name was announced, I stepped onto the stage and felt the lights hit my face. The applause rose like a wave, steady, warm, distant. I stood there for a moment, not speaking yet, feeling the cool of the microphone under my fingers. The director lifted his hand behind the glass wall, counting down silently for the live broadcast, and I steadied my breath. But before I could begin, a stir swept through the auditorium. A soft commotion from the back. A brief pause in the security line. Someone attempting to enter when they weren't authorized. Heads turned. I saw one guard step closer, posture rigid. Then another guard joined. The cameras kept rolling, but the corner of the audience shifted with quiet, curious tension. I didn't need to see clearly. I already knew. My parents' unmistakable voices carried through the space in faint, confused bursts, their tone sharp with disbelief. They were trying to explain who they were, insisting there must be a mistake. They sounded genuinely shocked to learn that their names were not on the list, that this event did not belong to them, that they could not simply walk in because they decided they wanted to. A ripple of whispers passed through the lower rows. I looked at the host, who looked at me, waiting to see if I would acknowledge it or continue as planned. And then something inside me clicked into place. The morning after the ceremony felt strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a thunderclap when the world hasn't yet realized the sound is still echoing. I woke before the sun, sat on the edge of my bed, and let the memory of last night replay in short, sharp pieces. The lights. The crowd. The moment I stepped away from the microphone. The murmur that moved through the room like a tide pulling in. But what stayed with me most was the exact second I realized that my story had finally crossed the line between being something I endured privately and something the world was now hearing out loud. My phone buzzed nonstop. Colleagues, acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all sending messages, each one almost identical in tone without realizing it. Saw the broadcast. Powerful. Hope you're all right. I read them without reacting. I knew what they weren't saying, that the cameras had caught just enough of the commotion at the back of the room for the public to fill in the rest. My parents had been stopped outside a nationally broadcast event, the same event where I spoke openly about distancing myself from people who repeatedly proved they didn't value showing up. It didn't take much for strangers to connect the dots. By mid-morning, a few smaller outlets posted summaries. Nothing dramatic. Just clipped observations about attention by the doors, a mention that 2 attendees were denied entry due to missing credentials, a hint that my speech had carried a personal edge. That was all it took. A single whisper on the internet spreads the way a spark travels through dry grass. But I didn't look at the articles. I didn't have to. I knew the story would grow on its own. Instead, I focused on preparing breakfast for my son, trying to hold on to a slice of normalcy before the day unraveled. He sat at the table talking about his science project while I packed his school bag. I kept my expression steady, even as my phone continued glowing beside the sink. When I dropped him off, He ran off to meet his friends without noticing anything off in my face. That alone steadied me more than any message that had come through. The quiet didn't last long. At home, my doorbell rang before I even reached the hallway. My parents stood on the porch, looking more shaken than I'd seen them in years. My mother's voice came out stiff and controlled, as if she had rehearsed every word but couldn't keep them in the order she planned. My father didn't speak at all at first. He only stared at me like he was trying to figure out whether I had done something to him or if he had done something to me. "Can we talk inside?" my mother asked. "No," I answered. The single word stopped her. For the first time, she looked unsure of herself. They didn't push past me. They didn't raise their voices. Instead, they stood there in a way that revealed something I hadn't expected, not anger, but fear. My father finally cleared his throat, searching for a steady tone, but his voice faltered. "We didn't know it would turn into something public," he said. I waited. They continued. My mother explained that someone from their social circle had called that morning to ask what happened at the event. Another message followed. Then another. Some gently curious, others less subtle, all pointing to the same detail, that the world saw them trying to enter a ceremony they weren't invited to after their daughter spoke about distancing herself from people who didn't value showing up. They were afraid of how it looked. Not of what it meant. Not of what they had done. Only how it landed. I let them talk until their words ran out. Then I said, "You made a choice." I made one too. My mother tried to smooth the moment the way she always did, attempting to frame the beach trip as a misunderstanding, insisting they had planned it last minute because they needed rest, claiming they didn't think missing one birthday would matter. My father finally added, "We didn't think you'd take it like this." That single line confirmed everything. They weren't apologizing. They were trying to regain control. "I didn't take it anyway," I said. I saw it for what it was. They didn't respond. For a moment, none of us moved. Then my father reached for my arm without thinking, the way he used to do whenever he wanted to steer a conversation back into familiar territory. I stepped aside. The small rejection unsettled him more than any words I had spoken. "We want to fix this," my mother said, clasping her hands. "But not out here. People might see." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about family. This was about exposure. "You're worried about who's looking," I said. "Not about me. Not about my son. Just the audience." Her expression tightened. She tried to deny it, but even she couldn't shape the lie fast enough. "I'm not having this conversation on the porch," I said. "And I'm not having it inside either." My father stepped forward again. "You made us look irresponsible." I almost laughed. Not from amusement, but from the sharpness of the irony. "You did that yourselves." My mother's composure broke for a second. "Do you understand what this can do to us?" she whispered. There it was, the truth behind their fear. Not regret. Not understanding. But worry over what their social circles would say, how this shift in the public narrative would affect the image they worked so hard to keep clean. I closed the door before they could say anything else. After they left, I sat at the kitchen table and let the silence settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel guilty. I only felt a strange steadiness, like the ground had finally aligned under my feet. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to make their excuses sound better than they were. By noon, more messages came in, several from colleagues who had heard about the scene outside the auditorium. One note came from the event's producer asking if everything was all right. I responded politely, saying it was handled. I didn't offer details. I didn't need to. But there was one message I hadn't expected. It came from a woman I barely remembered, someone who used to work with my parents long ago. She wrote that she saw the broadcast and recognized the tension immediately. Then she added something I couldn't ignore. "If you're open to it, we should talk. There are things I think you should know." I stared at the message longer than I planned. Her tone wasn't dramatic. It was simple, almost careful, as if she had debated sending it. I considered ignoring it, but a part of me, one that had grown sharper over the last few days, knew that silence wasn't the right choice anymore. I agreed to meet her at a quiet office building near her workplace. When I arrived, she ushered me into a small conference room and closed the door behind us. She didn't waste time with polite questions. "I'm not reaching out to stir anything," she said. but your parents used to say certain things about you and your family. And after last night, I think you deserve to know." The air in the room felt still, like the walls were waiting. She explained that years ago, during social events tied to their work, my parents often shared details that made them appear overwhelmed by family obligations. They portrayed themselves as selfless, always reaching for sympathy from whoever would listen. Sometimes they hinted that I wasn't independent enough. Other times they claimed they were constantly stepping in to help, as if they were the steady center holding everything in place. None of it was malicious in tone, she said, just convenient. A way to polish their image by reshaping the truth. Then she added, people believed them because they always said it lightly, as if they didn't realize they were revealing anything. But the pattern was there. I felt the floor under me shift. Not sharply, just enough to make me recalibrate. She continued, saying she never wanted to interfere, but after watching last night's broadcast, she realized the story they had been telling others no longer matched the story unfolding in public. And that mismatch was creating speculation. They're not the people they pretend to be, she said quietly. And now the cracks are showing. When I left the meeting, I walked through the lobby with a different kind of clarity. The moment outside the ceremony wasn't the beginning of the collapse, it was the moment the mask slipped far enough for others to see what had been underneath all along. I drove home slowly, thinking about every event from the past week, how each moment had lined up with unsettling precision. My parents had built an image that required constant upkeep, and for years, I unknowingly helped maintain it by staying quiet. Now that silence had broken, and they were scrambling to hold the surface together. But something deeper had shifted. This wasn't just about a missed birthday or a broadcast. This was about years of carefully crafted narratives they had fed to people who were now re-examining every story they once believed. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed a new message on my phone from a local journalist. Polite, professional, but unmistakably curious. She asked if I would be willing to comment on what happened at the ceremony. She didn't push. She didn't angle. She simply said she was covering the event's aftermath and wanted to ensure accuracy. I didn't respond. Not yet. But I felt something inside me align. The story had already left my hands once. This time, I would decide how it continued. As I set the table, I realized the air in the house felt different, charged, still, waiting. I heard my phone buzz again in the other room, but I didn't check it. I already knew the next steps were coming faster than I expected. And just as I turned off the kitchen light, another message appeared. This one wasn't from the media. It wasn't from a colleague. It came from someone I didn't expect at all. It read, "You should know something before this goes any further. Call me. It's important." A new thread. A new revelation. A new turning point. The message waited on my screen like a door I hadn't realized was unlocked. I hesitated before calling, not out of doubt, but because I sensed that whatever waited on the other end would shift everything I thought I already understood. When the line connected, the voice belonged to a former neighbor from years ago, someone who had quietly watched my parents maneuver through gatherings with effortless charm. She didn't waste time with greetings. She spoke with the calm of someone who had carried a truth for too long. She said she had seen the broadcast, then saw the online conversations circling my parents with growing suspicion. She added that she had held back before, thinking it wasn't her place, but now believed silence would only keep me blindsided. Then she told me something that pulled the air straight from the room. My parents had once asked her and others to keep their distance from me when I first moved out. Not to help. Not to support. They wanted to maintain the story that I depended on them more than I did. They painted me as fragile, overwhelmed, needing guidance they graciously provided. It made them look like steady caretakers. It made me look incapable. She said they never spoke harshly about me, just gently shaped the idea of who I was until others believed I needed them far more than they needed me. It wasn't anger that spread through me. It was recognition. A pattern I had felt but never been able to name. Every small doubt they fed me, every moment they insisted their choices were for my good, every subtle correction meant to keep me quiet, it all aligned. When I thanked her, she apologized for not telling me sooner. I didn't fault her. People rarely question stories that sound polished. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table, letting the pieces settle. The picture was clear now. My parents had spent years shaping their image by shaping me. And the moment I stepped outside that narrative, first by moving out, then by raising my son on my terms, and now by speaking publicly, they lost control. And they knew it. I didn't want them blindsided. I wanted them confronted. I called a journalist, the one who had reached out earlier, and agreed to speak, not in a dramatic broadcast, but in a straightforward interview. She arrived that afternoon with a small team, nothing intrusive, just enough to document the truth as I lived it. I told her what the world hadn't seen: the years of small absences, the selective presence, the careful way my parents shaped every event so they appeared supportive even when they barely showed up. I didn't embellish. I didn't exaggerate. I described the birthday they skipped after promising they were too busy, only to post photos that revealed exactly where they chose to be. I described the moment at the ceremony when they tried to enter as if they had earned a place in something they never cared to ask about. I explained the stories shared by people who had watched them shape their image at my expense. Every sentence felt clean, grounded, and final. The journalist listened without rushing me. When she asked what I wanted the public to understand, I said, "Some people build reputations so carefully that the truth feels disruptive. But the truth isn't disruptive. It's liberating." The interview aired that evening. It wasn't sensational. It was steady, measured, and honest. And that was enough. Within hours, the response grew. Not outrage, not noise, just a collective shift in how people viewed my parents. Comments appeared beneath their old posts, asking simple questions they couldn't answer without revealing the cracks. People noticed the pattern: the beach photos, the attempted entrance at the ceremony, the contrast between their polished online presence and the moment they were turned away. And once the public begins to see a fracture, they look for others. By the next morning, my parents showed up again. They didn't knock gently this time. Their urgency pushed through the doorway before they even spoke. My mother looked worn, her voice thin and strained. My father's expression was sharper than before, as if he believed firmness could undo the consequences already unfolding. "What have you done?" my mother asked, not with accusation, but with disbelief. "I told the truth," I said. She stepped back as if the words landed physically. My father insisted I fix it, that I clear up misunderstandings, that I tell people I had overreacted. His tone carried the old expectation that I would bend, that I would prioritize stability even when it cost me my own voice. But that expectation no longer held. "You shaped a story about me for years," I said. "Now the real one is out." My mother's composure cracked. "People are questioning everything we've built," she whispered. "They're not questioning everything," I replied. "Just the part built on pretending." They stared at me, not understanding how easily the truth moved through me now. The weight they once placed on my shoulders had fallen away, leaving me steadier than they expected. My father tried again, softer this time, asking if I could at least make a statement to calm things down. Something vague, something neutral, something that gave them space to reclaim control. "No," I said simply. He ended the conversation there, not because he agreed, but because he finally saw he had no influence left. They left without another word. That afternoon, I received a message from the event organizers. They wanted to release a statement clarifying what had happened at the ceremony, that the guest list had been finalized in advance, that security had followed standard procedures, that no attendee was singled out beyond the normal screening. The message was polite and factual. They asked if I would allow my portion of the broadcast to be clipped and shared to add context. I agreed. When the clip circulated, it reached far beyond anything the original broadcast had touched. People didn't react to it with shock. They reacted with recognition, the quiet recognition of a story many had lived in their own ways. The story of being expected to stay quiet so someone else's image remained tidy. The story of carrying a burden that was never acknowledged. The story of finally setting it down. By evening, everything settled into place without my involvement. No dramatic confrontations. No loud collapse. Just a simple, undeniable shift. People began seeing my parents not as victims of misunderstanding, but as architects of their own unraveling. Their carefully maintained image couldn't withstand the clear, steady truth that now filled its gaps. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed in a way that felt deeper than before. Later that night, I tucked my son into bed. He asked if everything was all right, sensing something different in the air. I told him yes, because it finally was. He rested his head on the pillow without another question. His trust felt like the only reward I needed. When the house grew quiet, I stood in the doorway of the living room, looking at the darkened space that had carried so much tension only days earlier. The silence now felt earned. Clean. Uncomplicated. The final message arrived just before midnight. It came from my mother. It read, "We didn't realize you would walk away." I stared at it for a long moment, understanding that this was the root of everything. They had never imagined I could remove myself from the story they built. They believed their image was unshakable. They believed I would always fill the role they assigned me. I typed my response slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. I didn't walk away. I stopped standing where you left me. I didn't wait for a reply. I turned off my phone, closed the living room door behind me, and stood in the quiet of my home, letting the final truth settle.